Thanks for joining us today. Today is really a talk about international marketing and e-commerce and achieving excellence in terms of expanding your business abroad. I work for TranslateMedia. I'm head of digital. I'm going to talk a bit about website localization before I hand over to Matt, operations director, to talk about some of the linguistic challenges, while I'm focusing on some of the more technical challenges. So my experience, I've had 15 years in digital marketing, lots of experience of localizing websites for international markets, particularly Europe, and I lead the digital excellence team at TranslateMedia. As part of that, we not only localize sites, we perform search engine optimization, and we translate content for social media and paid search advertising for large international brands. So in terms of internet penetration across the world, the number of internet users has pretty much tripled in the last 10 years or so. So it's gone from around 1 billion to 3 billion. And much of that growth has been driven by emerging markets, and that's as a result, the languages on the internet have pretty much been dominated by English to a certain extent, only 26% though. So about, in 1996, 80% of content on the internet was in English, and by 2005 it was only around 45%, and now it's just 26%. So in terms of global content, Chinese is pretty much catching up with English, and some of the other languages make up pretty much the top 10 languages make up about 80% of online content. So it's not a case of why you should localize, but how to go about doing that. So why localize? 55% of global consumers say they only buy products from websites that provide information in their own language. 51% of those would prefer to buy a product from a site with poor quality localization than one with just English language content. And 56% actually say that localization is more important than price. So it's clearly very important to users. And in terms of what to localize, there's a huge array of issues and challenges around things like your infrastructure. So on the left-hand side, you know, what domain you should purchase, whether that should be a .com, like a generic domain, or country code domain, like a .fr or a .de for France and Germany. In different countries, it's almost, some countries, it's almost impossible to rank on search engines without a local domain, like China. Then you've got to consider hosting. You know, where do you put your website? If you're selling to people internationally, you need to ensure that your website is hosted in a location where it's easy access to improve page speeds for local users. So, you know, you can consider things like content delivery networks to speed up access to digital assets such as video. And then you've got to consider content management systems, whether they support the languages that you'd like to localize into, whether they support, you know, things like mobile-first site design, which you might want to take into account if you're expanding into a market where the users are predominantly accessing the internet through their smartphones. As well as that, you'd also have to consider, you know, formats like calendars, dates and times, measurements and sizes, and address and telephone formats. I mean, the dates and times can be quite confusing because obviously you know that the US and the UK have different date ordering. So rather than the day being first, in the US it's the month, and in Japan, for instance, it's actually backwards. So you've got the year, the month, then the date. So they can pose some challenges to developers and to marketers when expanding into those regions. As well as that, you've got to consider character sets and encoding. So, you know, making sure that, you know, that your site can support Chinese and Arabic, for instance, and then text orientation. So reading content from right to left, as in Arabic content is pretty much displayed like the other way around. So you've got to ensure that your site can support that. And even stuff like alphabetical ordering is different in different languages. Even amongst European languages, sometimes the characters with accents are actually displayed in different orders. So that needs to be considered too. And finally, you need to consider things like currency, of course, but also payment methods. Visa and MasterCard and credit card payments aren't the only ones you need to consider, but you may want to consider not only PayPal, but local payment providers like Ideal in the Netherlands, or Alipay in China, or even some of the other smaller ones like Yandex Pay in Russia. And finally, you'd also need to consider privacy and data protection, because obviously dealing with different countries, they have different laws around how to handle consumer data. In places like Russia and Brazil, for instance, there are laws around where you host and store that data. So sometimes the data isn't even allowed to leave that country. So all this stuff really needs to be considered. And this is what today is all about, really. So once you've built your site and you've kind of got all these things in place, and you've got all your currencies and payment methods sorted for the local market, and your dates and calendars and address formats are all right, you've got your right CMS and your hosting infrastructure to support that, then you've got to consider all your digital marketing approaches. So just to go through a list of some of the approaches you might consider: content marketing, who Helen later on will be going into some detail about, search engine optimization or app store optimization, so getting your content in front of users on the various search engines that are used around the globe, which Ian from Search Labs will be talking about later. Paid search, again, you might have to pay to get that content up there initially before you optimize your site for local search engines. Social media, which Greg will be talking about in a lot of detail later. And then obviously some of the other approaches around affiliates, display, advertising, and marketplaces, which we'll go into some detail about later. So I'll hand you over to Matt, who's going to talk about some of the linguistic challenges associated with website development and localization. Thanks.
I'm Matt, so I'm the Ops Director at TranslateMedia. My background originally was I was a translator, so I'm a linguist by trade. But after 12 years in the industry now, I kind of focus on delivering website localization projects for clients, and have been involved in a lot of kind of large retail projects. So I'm going to talk about the language side of things. So Yusuf has ably talked about the kind of technical side of the project, and that's definitely one set of concerns that people have and have to address when they're going international with their site. But the next person we usually have to deal with is somebody who has concerns a little bit more like this guy, like Don from Mad Men. So he's more into the brand, the tone of voice, the style of language and the message, and how that's going to resonate with people in local markets. And these people have heard all the horror stories that you hear about brands that have got it wrong, and how embarrassing that's been. But more than that, they want to get it absolutely right for their brand. So they're really, really concerned with getting language into their site that delivers exactly the messaging along all the different parts of the user journey that people might have and interactions with their brand and their website. So I'm going to show you some examples of challenges that people have come across with this, what they've done to kind of meet those challenges and how they've kind of addressed them, and some little kind of tricks that they've used along the way and things that we've learned. So I hope it's kind of informative. So this is some content for a website and an app which delivers kind of magazine content for a luxury retailer. And this whole concept in this kind of ad is around all of these products that are suitable for kind of English country gentleman concept. So this works very well in the UK because we have a kind of history of a landed gentry, of people who have large manor houses that they go to at the weekend. And so this kind of look and the whole look and feel of this campaign, if you like, is all very kind of culturally bound. But because this is a luxury retailer, their customers are generally, when they're going international, tend to be Russia, Arabic and Chinese. Not just those languages, but typically that's what we find people go to. And in Chinese particularly, this doesn't work so well. The idea of a kind of countryside gentleman doesn't necessarily translate so well directly. In China, the countryside is kind of more associated with a kind of lower wage, lower skilled workers who might have tougher lives, let's say, than the urban elites who might be wealthier. So this doesn't really work as a direct translation. So you'd have to kind of work around it a little bit and adapt it. And maybe even play on the fact that this is the English country gentleman and you're trying to sell that in. So you wouldn't necessarily localize it in the same way as you would with other content. So it's a good example of how your content can kind of lead you down a route which makes it more difficult to sell to international audience. Next example. A few years ago, the onesie became a very popular kind of product for fashion retailers. And previous to that, onesie was maybe used for female garments for certain things, but it's now taken on a very different meaning. Everybody in English language in the UK knows that a onesie is this kind of product. It's something you lounge around in at home. You probably wouldn't leave the house in it, but people do. When we translated this, you'd think that it would be quite a fun thing to translate because really it's a word that doesn't really have any direct translation. But when you're translating into French, like this brand were, it becomes more difficult because French is quite specific about the way you use the language. So what they did was they used a word that already existed for the product that was most similar that they could find, which is the baby grow, which is why the baby's here on this slide. And the baby grow in French is called the grenouillère, and all they did was added the man or woman afterwards in French. So grenouillère femme and grenouillère homme. Sorry for my pronunciation for any French natives. And so that was seems like a fairly simple solution, but it's not particularly. It's kind of took a lot of thought to make it work in the local market and make sure that it was the right thing for the brand, etc. The interesting thing I think about this as well is that if you tried to do it back the other way, so if you started in French with grenouillère homme and you tried to come into English, you couldn't do a direct translation of man's baby grow. It just sounds really kind of weird and a bit creepy in English. So you'd still have the same problem, and you'd probably have to come up with a word like onesie to address that. Another example, the original yellow boot, sorry, not the big yellow boot. So this is Timberland's leading product, and this is a screenshot from their website, their Italian website. And you'll notice straight away, if you're Italian or even if you're not, that it's not all in Italian. Lots of it have been left in English. So 6-inch boots is still in English. The original yellow boot, best then, better now. I don't know if you can read that, but that's in English mixed with Italian. We see a lot of brands doing this. We call it selective localization, and they do it to trade on the heritage of the brand, if it works in the target market. So it turns out that these boots in Italy, there's a kind of positive association in Italian culture with kind of the working American person, and that's what these boots are associated with. So because of that, they're able to use the English because the English kind of transfers that heritage of where this product is from. And we see lots of brands doing this, particularly if they have a strong association with a particular culture. So brands like Burberry, perhaps, or Aston Martin, we might see them doing something like this. And the last example is a little bit different. It's not from websites, but when we were talking about this in our office, one of my colleagues is French, and she said one thing that kind of blew her mind when she grew up in her teens and she started to go out into the wider world was finding out that the Star Wars characters had different names in English than they did in French. So she was used to D2R2 or D2R2, and she was used to Z6PO, which is pronounced Z6PO. And the reason for this, the reason they did this, it seems kind of weird. Why would you do it? Well, if you say R2D2 in French, and again, I don't know, I'm not French native, but if you say R2D2 in French, apparently it doesn't sound as good. It feels wrong to say that in French compared to D2R2. And the same with C3PO, it wouldn't really work. So they changed it to Z6PO. And the clever thing about this is that they phonetically, they sound kind of similar to the English still. So even though they've changed it, they've kept it keeping close enough so that when they say it, it's not so far away from the English. So there's still this kind of universal language of Star Wars characters' names. And some other examples, Darth Vader's Dark Vador, I think, in French, and Darth Fenner in Italian. And so it's kind of just changing it slightly so that the phonemes, the sound combinations come off the tongue a bit easier for those natives of those languages. And it's quite clever. So it's quite difficult language. There's a lot involved. So aside from the technical challenges that Yusuf talked about, there's a huge kind of universe of things to think about there. There's a lot here as well. But some things we can learn from these examples are if you develop your content and the strategy for that content kind of internationally from the outset and look at local market insights, then you won't find yourself down an alleyway with your content like the Countryside Gentleman, where it gets very difficult to translate. Creativity, like with the baby grow example, is useful, but it also requires time even to come up with something simple like that. So if you have taken your content down one of those alleyways, you're going to have less time because it's going to need more work. You can use the heritage of your brand, but to do that you need target market insights, really. You need to understand how your brand and how those products are already perceived, and then you can do something really effective. And then you also have to think about how things are spoken as well. There's another example. Toyota had a model of car called the MR2, which in French, if you say it in a French accent, it sounds like you're swearing. So you have to think about these things as well. So that's the kind of summary. So thank you. Yusuf and I will be around all day. Those are our details. And we have a guide to website localization that you can download for free just in return for your email address from our website if anybody's interested.